creating all this risk, when it was diffusing all of these derivatives throughout the country, throughout people's pensions here, small towns in Iceland, in Greece, in Norway, basically wrecking the world, right? Instead of containing that, instead of breaking up the banks, instead of saying, you know what, this is bad for the overall economy, you are going to basically screw things up, and we will be taking the fallout for years and years and years to come. So I absolutely agree with you, Alex, that the Federal Reserve, the ECB in Europe, that basically they are a part of why Wall Street has been able to do what it did. They're the fuel on the fire. They're the feeding mechanism. Without the Fed printing money, subsidizing the risk, guaranteeing big banks to become bigger. For example, JP Morgan Chase, when it bought Bear Stearns in March of 2008, they didn't buy that. They basically had the government, us, back the risk. That risk of the defaults of the assets that it bought from Bear Stearns when it became a bigger bank by sucking it into its mechanism were backed by the Federal Reserve, therefore, and the Treasury Department and us. That's not a healthy way to run an economy. They're tremendously at fault, and it is something that needs to be adopted into the message, because without the mechanism for printing money for subsidizing risk that hurts the rest of the population, this mechanism wouldn't be able to have gotten as big as it got.
Sure.
And it wouldn't be maintaining itself right now under the premise, under the illusion that somehow there's, for example, in the United States, the banks are somehow healthier, which they are not. They are insolvent. They are made to appear healthy by the fact that they're not marking their books correctly. They don't have to, and they're being subsidized and funneled with cheap money and guarantees and loans and other kinds of subsidies from the Federal Reserve.
Well, Nomi, I want to go back to the question, though, because I totally agree with you. Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, all part of the same consortium of these big six mega banks who created the tens of trillions in derivatives. Now they infect everything and hold the whole financial system hostage, saying, give us more power or we'll destroy everything. Clearly, there's a method to the madness where they create Ponzi schemes so big that instead of going to jail like Ponzi or Bernie Madoff, they get the world. So clearly this is premeditated, and now they're announcing this Bank of the World and austerity. I was just getting you to speak to Obama being Wall Street finance, just like the Republican leadership, but having the gall, Republicans, mainline, just say Wall Street can do no wrong, give them banker bailouts, that's conservative, but welfare moms are evil. They're hypocritical, it's obvious, it's silly. But with Democrats, they're coming out saying capitalism's the problem, when it has nothing to do with it, that government teamed up with mega banks and tied taxpayer money to it. I mean, that's nothing but an insider monopoly scam. I was wanting to get your take just on this spectacle of Michael Moore and all these people lecturing us, saying capitalism doesn't work, and then demonizing the entire private property system because a group of monopolists teamed up with government to screw us.
I mean, that's saying that this isn't what classical capitalism was defined to be. This isn't everybody has an equal opportunity to get ahead and to create a business and to produce and to have a job and to create a job and all of that. That's not what happened here. Well, you're right. What happened here was a completely lopsided way of funneling money into the wrong risks that had the knock-on effect of creating a decimated global economy and a depressed economy. This isn't classical capitalism. So sort of moaning on just capitalism, and I think capitalism can work if it's a progressive kind of capitalism where there actually is a fairness to this, where banks that have to fail, where people can get the right amount of money for jobs that actually exist in order to feed their families.
Yeah, you don't give $16 trillion in bailout money to banks and then they hoard it and use it to not loan and shut down their whole service sector. I mean, it's incredible. We need to get back to free credit, basically, government issued. That's the American system, pre-1913 Federal Reserve. And then if people want to loan their private money, that's another issue. But to watch tens of trillions of dollars just given to these people and then they hoard it is incredible. Now, going back 7, 8 years ago, you're a big managing director, you're moving up the ladder to the top of Goldman Sachs, and you quit, you leave, you start writing best-selling books like It Takes a Pillage, Other People's Money, Jacked, and other books. You started writing for The Nation, for Alternate, for Fortune, Mother Jones. BBC, CNBC, MSNBC, CNN, PBS, you start coming out against them. And I remember seeing videos of you 5, 6 years ago when the financial crisis hadn't happened yet. This wasn't on the radar. You were warning. So I want to go back to square one before we bring it to the future and where you see the world going. What did you see inside Goldman Sachs and inside, the highest levels of the global financial ruling class? What did you see that made you get out of there?
Well, I saw, and I left right after Enron and WorldCom in the last spate of frauds that we all remember. And what I saw was a tremendous amount of manipulation and lying. I had a boss who is now one of the senior, boss's boss, who basically ran the credit division at the time, which was, where credit derivatives were kind of spawned and born, and that business obviously grew out of control over the many years since, who would basically boast about his trips to Washington. We can't have this meeting because I'm going to be in Washington. And why they were in Washington was to basically collude the SEC and other members in Washington so that they would allow Goldman Sachs and also other investment banks to have more leverage, to basically be able to borrow against crappy securities and assets and book positions in order to make something of them that they weren't, so they could compete with the likes of JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup that had all these people's deposits and people's loans, and because of Glass-Steagall repeal were bigger mega banks, and they wanted to basically compete. So what happened was there was this beginning of a real race to do that, and I was looking at tremendously bad deals. I mean, this was around the time just even before Enron became known to the world per se as being fraudulent, but the energy companies, the broadband companies, the communication companies, what the banks were just doing with each other in terms of buying and selling packages of really faulty loans so they could take get a capital sort of check mark on their books from the Fed and basically not have to hold as much money behind their risk. That was all starting to really heat up around then, and I really saw that was not going to end well. And the first book I wrote, actually the very first piece I wrote was for Fortune, but it spawned other people's money, was that these banks together are creating a massive problem, and Washington is letting them. The derivatives market at the time for credit and CDOs, which are now these part of the toxic asset pyramid, were babies at the time. They're literal babies. And I was looking at these positions growing, and the first thing I wrote in the first chapter of Other People's Money was you got to watch this credit derivatives department. It is not transparent. It is a disaster waiting to happen. So are CDOs and everything else. So I think part of it, and I had no idea that this would grow into such a catastrophe, because the amounts were so much smaller then, and it was let loose for so long. The risk, the toxicity of all of it has grown so much over the years since that it became a much bigger problem globally for everyone. But again, all of that was I'm not going to say beginning when I left. I mean, it was beginning before I left, but it was really coming to its sort of first head point. And given all of that, I just what was being done inside was wrong, and what was going to happen later was going to be a disaster. And I felt the need to sort of leave, and I couldn't stop talking or writing about it. I still can't, because I think it's really important.
Well, it certainly is. It's threatening our entire civilization, everybody's savings, our currencies, our economies, as everything is fed into this fraud in an attempt to prop it up. And I've interviewed so many economists, but you were inside of it. I want to get your take on this and then ask, where is it all headed? But every economist I talk to explains we're talking about over 1,000 trillion in derivatives and garbage. Huge national, corporate, private debts at all-time record, rotting infrastructure, and third world countries being destroyed by the increase in commodities because of currency devaluations. And it's a black hole that we have no hope of paying off because it's a fraud. So A, where do you see this going? B, okay, the banks use the crises to hold everybody hostage and get more and more power. When everything's wrecked, do they just think some authoritarian system is going to keep them safe from what they've created? Because they're unleashing hell here.
Well, the first thing is, because of their hold and because of what they have created and how they've been subsidized by governments and by central banks, they really do believe they can ride it out. I mean, even just recently, we have another $400 billion sort of twist policy, Operation Twist. I call it Operation Great Depression too. But of the Fed basically buying $400 billion of longer term maturities. What are you doing there? You're just sort of like pushing the problem into the future. You're not solving anything. You're not deleveraging these derivatives. You're not saying to banks that they have to really mark their books at where they're at, and if that means they look insolvent, so be it. They need to be destroyed, or they need to fail in a proper way. None of that is happening. Because none of that is happening, and because instead there is continued money and bailout funds and debt being thrown at this problem rather than determining a solution from the bottom up for this problem, it will continue to grow. And so what I see, and I wish I didn't, is that there's no opposition to this. Even if banks, the larger banks, were to be allowed to fail, which they are not, it would create a knock-on effect, and then there would have to be some strong decisions from people.
So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
But here's the thing, all of this could still be stopped, and it could have been in 2008. We could have said, you know what, JP Morgan Chase, you're not allowed to have Bear Stearns. You know what, Bank of America, who was completely insolvent and was facing all sorts of settlement cases, all sorts of fraud, you can't have Merrill Lynch. All of this should have done back then. It wasn't. It can still be done now. These banks can be made more transparent and smaller so that we can see what we are dealing with, rather than propping it up with money and money and money being printed, with our currency being devalued, with debt being accumulated. Okay,
I understand there's ways to extricate ourselves. The problem is the bankers have put their people in the command positions in the Republican and Democratic parties. The only person that will talk about the elephant in the room is Ron Paul. He gets demonized and attacked. They're clearly not changing course. So where are we going in closing?
So we're going to continue to get worse. I mean, we had a Great Depression that lasted for 7-8 years globally in the 30s, and that's what I'm writing about in my fiction book in Black Tuesday. But it's going to continue now because it's a deeper problem now. There were more derivatives, there were more fraud, there's more money being printed to subsidize it. I think this is going to last longer.
Tell us about Black Tuesday, the new book. This is your first fiction book, but it's also based in reality, kind of a history or near future type book. And I know sometimes a fiction based on reality can get more attention than even, I guess, the last couple of best-selling New York Times best-selling books that you've written that are nonfiction.
Yeah, and I thought that way there could be a human face to it. Actually, someone very kindly suggested the book was my way of putting a human face on Goldberg's The Crash in 1929 book, and that wasn't really my intent. It was a nice compliment. But basically the idea is that, it's about a woman, it's about a family, it's about sort of this oppression of, a struggling working class and a struggling middle class at the time, and how bankers literally, take this entitlement and kind of tell themselves that it's okay, it's just one bad signature here, it's one bad fraudulent deal there, and it grows and grows and grows.